Well, hello. Welcome to another ImagineFX tutorial. I'm Tom Foster. Apologies if I sound a little out of sorts. I have a horrible cold at the moment, which to viewers of any of my previous tutorials must seem like a perpetual state that I'm in. But I have got a slightly better microphone this time, so hopefully that should compensate for it. This tutorial is on, well, I mean, it's not going to be an hour just of how do you draw a cape snagged on an antenna. I feel that might be something of a limited palette from which to paint a learning experience. That's beautifully worded, wasn't it? So we're just going to look at kind of capes in general, cloth dynamics, clothing drapery, all those kinds of very exciting subjects, which it will behoove you to get to grips with if you are considering a career in the illustrative arts. Again, apologies if I start sneezing or sniffing at any point during this commentary. I always seem to do these just off the back of a fairly substantial project with a lot of pressure, and my immune system just seems to take a total dive. But let's ignore that and look at what's happening on screen. So here I'm using DAZ 3D, which is a 3D posing software, and these are all prefabricated models. I didn't build these models. The figure is what's called a Genesis model. They come as standard with DAZ, although this is the Genesis 2 model. I believe the Genesis 3 is the one that comes as standard now, but I believe you can still download the Genesis 2 for free. And I tend to use the Genesis 2 just because most of the poses I have in my pose library are for Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 models, both of which are compatible with this one. And I'm just sort of manipulating him a little bit here to make him a bit more lithe and sort of tall and thin, which is my preferred way of depicting superhero characters, a sort of athletic look rather than a powerhouse look. I feel it humanises them a bit more. As for the antenna, I think that's just got an asset called Rooftop Antenna from a Rooftop Pack, which I downloaded for, I don't know, some small cost from the DAZ website. Other posing softwares or pieces of posing software are available. This is just the one I use. It's free. You only have to pay for assets, but you get quite a lot to start with. Anyway, so I've done all the posing now. Lighting and things wasn't particularly important because I knew I was going to be casting these particular assets in silhouette, so only the outlines really were needed. They're just using I believe, a threshold command in order to get a nice clean outline, or as clean as possible anyway. And I will soon begin drawing the cape. Apologies if this is if what's going on screen is doing so quite quickly, but well, actually this one it shouldn't be too bad. Sometimes I do have to speed up the videos quite a bit to get them down to about an hour, because often they have to spend quite a few hours on a project. This one wasn't too bad because I was able to just economize on detail by having stuff in silhouette, so that was great. So now having two fairly kind of clean silhouettes to work with, I'm about to start drawing my cape. And before I do that, I'm just going to, oh well, it's already started, but I'm just going to jettison some nasal mucus. Just excuse me for a second. A very familiar noise to those of you who have listened to my tutorials in the past. Um, I'm not typically a very unwell person. It's just something about ImagineFX tutorials always seem to be done when my immune system is at a total low. But I've said that already. And, at the 5 minute mark, to be repeating myself is inexcusable. But you will find it happening towards the 45-minute mark and the half-hour mark and probably the 20-minute mark as well. Now, this way I have of drawing in Photoshop may seem a little bit counterintuitive. It's not the kind of preferred method. A lot of people would use Manga Studio or something similar, or at least use a more reliable drawing tool to get kind of cleaner lines. And I do like clean lines, but for the purposes of these tutorials, I like to kind of strip down the working method so that the only information really that I'm that's necessary to be able to follow the tutorial is the things that the tutorial is supposed to be about. I don't want people to be at a disadvantage as a result of not knowing how to use kind of different types of brush tools and everything. So I just use a regular brush tool, no fancy settings or anything, just black on white, and create some layers for, like, I'm working on a separate layer for my black outlines here, and then I'll work on, and there's my colors are on a different layer and everything. So it's very, very simple to follow, or it should be anyway. Plus, it's just a little bit more straightforward for me to do it that way, because I don't know. There's something it's an unusual way of working in Photoshop. It's very much a kind of MS Paint type of way of working, and if you can create a sort of reasonably convincing image using an MS Paint method, then you're probably doing something right in terms of your drawing ability. So just filling out some of the shadows and stuff, I'll go on to kind of touch these up a bit and make them a bit more realistic. But I'm using my photo reference, which you'll see in the issue of the magazine. If you have, if you've actually bought it, which I hope you have. Otherwise, I would say you're taking money out of my pocket, which isn't technically true because, I don't get paid royalties for this. But you are, in a way, taking money out of my pocket because, of course, if ImagineFX goes bust from people stealing the online resources, then I'm up the river. Well, maybe not. Could probably do some other type of work. But please don't steal. I get the feeling that the editorial staff at ImagineFX would be very unhappy if I were to condone stealing the online resources from the magazine. And well, they should be. They work very hard, and so do we on making these magazines interesting. Evidently not so much on the tutorial commentaries. This is getting a bit interminable. Sorry, but the me drawing to and using a photo reference to try and sort of get something as accurate as possible. I mean, there's only so much detail I could go into about the method of that because I am essentially trying to parrot the information in another 2D image, which the principles of which should be relatively straightforward. Try and understand the underlying forms rather than just blindly copying areas of light and shadow. Your drawing will always be better if you try and draw it with the three-dimensional forms in mind rather than just trying to copy verbatim what you're drawing, because ultimately your eye will tend not to fully understand the visual information, and also, or your brain rather, I suppose. Also, you are in a way compensating for the two-dimensional image's lack of a third dimension in order to give a sense of weight and substance, which a photograph and certainly a drawing copied from a photograph wouldn't necessarily have. So slightly, more pronounced edges and shadows can be quite a good way of doing that. That's why I like line art so much, because it tends to kind of inherently compensate for the fact that it's a two-dimensional medium. A lot of the time, line drawings will actually look more real and three-dimensional than photorealistic ones. And in my opinion, all the best kind of classical painters and things did in some way compensate for the limitations of a 2D medium in order to create a more compelling and visually rich image. So it's all very dry. Yes. So what else? Oh God, 10, 11 minutes in, and I'm already struggling for things to say. I had something in mind as well, and I can't remember what it was. It does raise the question, of course, why bother recording a commentary for this if there's so little a kind of ancillary information that you can offer that's not in the body of text. But in my opinion, this is just personal preference. I like a video that has some verbal instruction as well. I find something a little bit kind of cold and sterile about watching somebody paint or draw with no kind of guiding voice to make you feel like it can be informative, but over the course of an hour, you need something to kind of occupy your full attention. That's why I suppose you could listen to music or something, couldn't you? Or listen to somebody more interesting speak, listen to an audiobook or a podcast. Well, apologies for not making that an obvious option by recording a commentary. But I will stand by my preferences. Now, right, good. I'm about to bring the photo reference on screen. Now, you may notice that there is a sort of significant sag in the middle, or sort of towards the kind of right-hand side of the image, the sort of middle of the towel, where it comes off the shoulders, I suppose it would be, which I haven't yet fully incorporated into the image that I'm drawing. And of course, that's as a result of a little bit of gravity, the third force at work in our image. And I just wanted to suggest, like, if it had been a superhero mid-flight, and just in the kind of act of snagging the cape onto the antenna and ripping it while flying at full force, I would have gone for a far more stretched cape with more sort of straight lines and everything. But as it is, there is a slight element of like the cape having relaxed a little bit as a result of the hero turning around. So you get this little sag in the middle of the cape, just to suggest that his movement has slowed down a bit. And I think I do put a little bit of, in a way, there should have been a fourth arrow in this drawing, because I do add a little bit of kind of fluttering quality to the 2 points at the end of the cape, in order to suggest a very slight air current. So an arrow symbolizing wind could perhaps have been blowing, or placed somewhere near the bottom of the image, pointing from right to left. But of course, that would or could appear to simulate, particularly if subtitled, wind could, of course, potentially be rather embarrassing and misleading to the reader, who may mistake it for a different type of wind. Flatulence, that's the word I was looking for. I can't believe I struggled to find that word. It's such a bedrock of my vocabulary. I use it all the time. Right, so cleaning up the color here, just so I'm not going over the lines. This is all fairly self uh, evident. Um, but just getting trying to get some nice clean shadows underneath the like edges of the cape there to suggest to create a sense of depth between uh, the cape, the side of the cape nearest to us, and the side of the cape farthest from us in the image. Um, it's important to distinguish the foreground or the middle ground from the background, um, to create a sort of sense of depth. And shadow is often a good way to do that. Just going to blow my nose again. Just hang on 1 second. Sorry. Apologies again. Um, so, um, with regards to the rendering, the little bits of hatching that I'm putting on there, you'll notice that most of the hatching I'm doing, and this will be a familiar point for those of you who've watched previous tutorials, but most of the hatching I'm doing is in one kind of diagonal direction. I'm not having really kind of conflicting hatching lines, just because generally this helps to give a sense of a kind of that makes the lighting a bit more kind of unified. If you've got competing directions of hatching kind of strokes, then it can sort of suggest competing light sources and look a little bit less convincing and three-dimensional. It's just it's a small point, but it's one that bears repeating, because it can help if you work in the medium of line art as I do, then all these little things can make a difference to your drawing. It's not a hard and fast rule. I will incorporate some lines in different, hatching lines in different orientations now and again, where a certain kind of 3D object um, it demands it, which I'll maybe go into on another tutorial when such an object comes into play. But for the moment, I think pretty much all the hatching I'm doing is pretty omnidirectional. I'm just about to. Oh, not yet. I thought I was about to touch up the anatomy a little bit. Oh, touch up the anatomy. That sounds vaguely sexual. Um, at some point, I do tweak the anatomy of our sort of superhero character, as these 3D models um, rendered are really perfect. The back muscles in this instance are a little bit kind of inaccurate. So I'll go in and tweak that a little bit. But for the moment, I'm just trying to create a relatively pleasing line drawing before I concentrate on the finer points of the color. Here it still looks quite ragged and sort of shapeless. It doesn't look particularly three-dimensional, which is something that if I were working at, pen and paper or brush and paper or pencil and paper, would maybe take a little bit less time to refine, just because those media are a little bit easier to be sort of accurate or to govern more strictly. For me, anyway, I find I work with just a basic graphics tablet, about 30 quid or something it cost, and that was, maybe 10 years ago. So I don't doubt the technology has improved since then, or that more expensive technology would be better. But as I say, I like to work with fairly sort of rudimentary tools, just so that I'm not creating a kind of elitist tutorial where I'm saying, right, well, you can achieve a similar outcome provided that you have the following resources. This should be enough to, and I could have worked in pen and paper or pencil and paper or brush, but I wouldn't have been able to record it so effectively. I may get a a webcam or a GoPro or something at some point to in order to record my practical tutorials. But generally speaking, this is a digital art magazine, so the founding principles, while the same as in traditional drawing, uh, I'd rather communicate through a digital medium of some sort. Anyway, ah, uh, this is this is this isn't easy, you know. Recording all this, one person trying to keep the energy levels up on your own, talking for an hour uh, without interruptions. Um, that's why all the best DVD commentaries tend to have at least two people on them. And podcasts. It's rare you get a good podcast with just one person speaking, nobody else in the room to bounce ideas off of. And yes, I will, for those of you who've listened to me before, I will try and get more people on board for these commentaries again in the future. I was very happy with the way the last one turned out. That was a kind of group session. But the commentary is the last thing I do on a project like this. It has to be. Everything else, you know, all the drawing has to be done to be in the video. The video all has to be edited together in order for me to do commentary. And this being the very last thing, it tends to be quite close to deadline time. And that can be quite short notice to get somebody involved to do a commentary. Obviously, if I planned ahead, I could have asked somebody in advance. You know, I've got a deadline around about here. Would you be free to do a commentary? But in this instance, it would have all been for naught anyway, because I feel so kind of ill today. And not only would I not feel up to it, but I wouldn't want to inflict my lurgy on somebody else. Speaking of this lurgy, by the way, I don't just mention it in order to excuse my my kind of nasal voice or my blocked up sounding voice and my occasional sort of intermissions to blow my nose. I also mentioned it because when you work in the comics industry or any industry that is geared around quite intense periods of work, and then sometimes, you know, just periods of where the pressure is completely off and you're free to either have a few days off or do some kind of more low maintenance work. It is quite easy to get ill, mildly ill or even seriously ill, as soon as your body starts to relax, and your mind starts to relax. Often the projects which provoke illness are the ones which you know, you put the most pressure on yourself to do a really good job. You know, when I did some ImagineFX tutorials just after finishing my first ever cover for 2000 AD, my first ever cover, and it was my first ever Judge Dredd cover as well. That was a really big deal for me professionally, and as a result, the immune system took a total dive. And if you've listened to the commentaries, those particular commentaries, one was a digital painting of a sort of elderly woman's face, and the other was a running person. Oh, that was the one where I had more people in the room. That one was okay. I didn't come across as too ill in that one, because I could always take a break from speaking and let somebody else speak. But yeah, the one with the actual painted one was, I was very stuffed up. I felt quite unwell. And now recording this one was my first ever Dread story that I just kind of come to the end of inking and penciling. And getting that sort of, the bulk of that work out of the way presented a huge relief for me, because I worked on it for quite a long time and it was really exacting about it. There was a lot of pressure exerted purely by myself. There wasn't a lot of professional pressure placed on me by my editor. My editor's great actually for that. But yes, it can be quite enfeebling when you finish a job like that and then suddenly everything crashes. My only advice in that regard would be to try and keep yourself as fit and healthy as possible. You know, when I'm doing a job that has a lot of pressure and stress, I tend to towards the end of it anyway, tend to eat quite poorly, not exercise very much because I'm concentrating on, working as many hours as possible. So I'll eat lots of sugary food to keep my energy levels up. Um, and I won't do very much exercise because I won't feel I have the time. And as a result, my general fitness levels go down, my immune system goes down, and everything suffers as a result. So don't follow my example. I am suffering that you may learn. I'm a lot like Jesus Christ in that regard, and many other regards as well. But what I'm doing at the moment on screen, and to get back to that for a second, is I have created another layer. I've made the initial drawing transparent, and I've created another layer, sort of a layer, sort of like a linking, sorry, sort of like an inking layer, with the previous one being a kind of penciling layer, just to clean up all these lines as much as possible. Having a kind of template line there to begin with, it's remarkable how much easier it makes it to get a sort of to guide your hand and create a sort of slightly smoother line. Obviously, it does still have the limitations of being kind of pixel art, where you get these slightly raggedy edges, and of course, this is not something that this is for tutorial purposes. So it's not perhaps as finished as something that would go to press in my comic book work, but I believe it demonstrates the principles just as well. And I have actually, in a lot of ways, gone to more effort and time by doing it digitally, whereas I would normally just do it, traditionally, and well, except for the colours, and thereby have a slightly lighter burden. So be grateful is essentially the takeaway from that. There's that little bit of flappy going on at the end of the little pointy corners of the cape. They're sort of just drifting slightly in the breeze, which is nice. It creates a sense of a real world rather than just kind of a static laboratory environment, which is not helped by the fact that having just block colours, silhouettes for the rest of the image does make it look something like a kind of instructional illustration that you might find on the back of an airplane seat. But yeah, as you can see, starting to get a reasonably clean looking line drawing now, which I can kind of colour a little bit and get the basic shapes and outlines of the image defined, which will help us to add kind of convincing detail later, as we won't be constantly rejigging things in order to try and make them more accurate and everything. It can be good to define your outlines and sort of major areas of shadow and stuff quite early on. Sorry, just excuse me one more second. Sorry about that. Now, with regard to that idea of rendering the kind of major blocks of line and colour first, before moving on to the rendering, or the finer sort of colour rendering, one sort of immediately apparent question brought up by this tutorial and a few others that I've done is, why eschew digital painting, sort of traditional digital painting, if digital painting can be said to have a tradition at this early stage in its life. Well, aside from the fact that I generally work in line art, and therefore that's sort of more my area of expertise, I would say that for trying to communicate the basic principles of any sort of reasonably kind of realist form of draftsmanship and painting and everything, or illustration in general, generally it's more effective to go back to the kind of basic foundations of drawing, because drawing ability, if you can't draw, then you'll be if you're a poor that draftsman, you'll be a poor painter, generally speaking, provided you're not working solely in abstract terms. And even then, traditional drawing skills can improve your work a great deal. But yes, you're painting is in many ways just drawing in color. I mean, there are elements of color theory and detail elements of rendering that you don't necessarily encounter as much in line drawing because you can kind of shortcut them in a line drawing. But for the most part, it all comes down to how well you can draw. So if I'm going to, with a relatively limited amount of time, try and communicate a basic visual principle of form and physics and things, I find it a lot better to do so in a kind of more stripped down fundamental way than try and create a fully rendered digital painting that communicates those things effectively. Because what you'll tend to notice if you are a digital painter, or, if you or a painter in general, if you work in that medium, if you work in full color and don't use line art really, is that the very, very last stage of a painting tends to be where it starts to look kind of accurate and solid and real. Up until then, there seems to be a lot of what you might call pillow shading, which is something that digital kind of 8-bit artists and 16-bit artists might be familiar with. It's the kind of shading that you would get, you get in Street Fighter 2 and stuff like that, where everything is kind of shaded fairly uniformly, from outline to the kind of central portion of an image. Everything is given an equal amount of shading, darker towards the outline, lighter towards the middle. That's not. Obviously, good painters know to render shadow correctly, but generally, it's that last little bit of prestige on an image, the little highlights, the little white highlights, the little extra clean edges on your shadows that you would add towards the end of an image that actually take it away from that slightly pillow shaded look and make it look sort of real and three-dimensional. And when you're doing a sort of reasonably short little tutorial like this, you don't tend to really have time to get to that stage, and you kind of have to go through a whole lot of a whole lot of kind of unnecessary detail to get there. So this, I think, is just a more effective way of doing it. I apologise, I seem to be drifting more into kind of very, very general principles and issues of preference, rather than anything particularly didactic. So I apologise for that, but as I say, filling an hour, not always the easiest thing to do on your own. But here, as you can see, I've taken that principle to heart, and I'm trying to fill in just major areas of shadow quite kind of cleanly, and obviously there's some raggedy lines there, but I'm trying to give some clean edges to my shadows and things, and not use too many different tones and get overcomplicated. Because when you're trying to build up shadow, with various weights of colour and everything, it is very easy to get into that kind of marshmallowy kind of plasticine-y look to everything, where nothing seems properly defined and it all seems a bit kind of chocolate boxy. It doesn't look like a nicely dynamic image. It looks like somehow it looks a bit kind of tacky and not particularly well put together. So I'm trying to avoid that and create something that kind of works relatively well on its own reasonably quickly. Because in comics you tend to have to work relatively quickly. I'm quite a slow artist, but deadlines are there and loom up on you surprisingly fast. To quote one of the great musical artists of the 20th century, objects in the rearview mirror may be closer than they appear. Meatloaf is not only a great singer, songwriter, if he does write his own songs, I don't know, but also philosopher. And I don't think there's anybody out there in the academic world who would disagree with that. The cape itself is to receive a rip and a sharp prong of antenna jutting through it, but we're just dealing with the basic kind of effects of physics on the shape of the cape at the moment, and trying to nail those down as well as possible. And I am trying to be in a way, as slavish to the contours of the photo reference as possible, while taking a few liberties in order to add a little bit more kind of tension in the cloth. It was difficult for me without having another person to kind of pull the towel in the photograph to really get a sort of strong sense of force into the cape. So, I'm essentially using the same forms, the same folds and everything, but just slightly longer, slightly flatter, like as in pulled slightly more horizontally, with slightly less sag, to create something that is a little bit more visually dynamic. Because while, as I've said in the text, you are working sans movement, and therefore, aren't able to, are trying to create something that could just as easily be molded from clay or carved from stone, as made out of cloth. You do want to suggest some sense of movement, to communicate the properties of that fabric. Otherwise your stuff can look a bit static. There are people who, when they draw capes, they end up looking like, I don't know, if you've ever seen like a frozen towel or that American flag that's on the moon or something, they seem quite static. The folds in them seem a little bit too solid and unyielding and not flowing enough. So you have to kind of be careful there to kind of compensate for that, to create a more dynamic image. But generally speaking, the forms themselves should be rendered as you would any other, solid three-dimensional thing. Excuse me, once more, I don't know how effectively me kind of leaning away from the mic and blowing into a handkerchief is working. So feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter at JumbleCashback, JumbleCashback, and let me know how incredibly disgusting this tutorial sounds to you. I also have an Instagram account which I believe will be credited in the or cited in the next to this entry, or in the kind of roster of creators featured in this Q&A section. I'll probably plug those again at the end of the commentary, just to give me something to do, if nothing else. So excuse me once again while I dispense with nature's unguent. I don't know what that means, but, I'm having to speak extemporaneously here, so give me a break. Oh, Jesus. Sorry. Not Jesus, of course. Just some other less offensive term. So now that I'm really, smudging, kind of, not using the smudge tool, but just kind of using the eraser tool, or maybe even just lightening the layer of shadows. I can't remember. No, I think I did use the eraser tool on sort of like a fairly low transparent or opacity setting to just smooth out those lines. Because of course all the work, or most of the work, in terms of where the areas of light and shadow, the main kind of edges of things are, is done in the drawing. That's the purpose. Your line drawing should communicate most of that information, and there should really only be room for very slight variances in tone in your colours, and certainly not too much darkness in those tones. I don't know how this will print exactly, but those reds might actually be quite dark. So maybe I should have lightened those up a bit. Apologies if the colour does appear to be swamping the line art a little bit, but as you'll see on screen, that's not quite, unless you've got your screen perfectly calibrated to represent print values. That should seem a little kind of more distinct and lighter and things. I do sometimes forget to compensate for that, for which I apologise. Um, but yeah, as you can see, it's already starting to look more or less like a solid object, um, with some fairly kind of convincing three-dimensional properties. So certainly in comparison to the silhouette kind of bodies around it. Um, I mean, oh yeah, just adding a kind of secondary shadow there, which is, I mean, that's not 100% kind of accurate because of course there's only one light source in this image really, which is the sun. So there wouldn't really tend to be those double shadows like that. But again, I just wanted to emphasize the depth between the area of the Cape closest to us and the area farthest from us. So I've kind of cheated a little bit there, and that is not necessarily commensurate with the line art. But I mean, and in a way that's wrong. Like I mean, I know this sounds like a sort of slightly obvious point to make, but I and a lot of people who do tutorials in ImagineFX are you know, I'm not or are not an infallible source. We will all have our own bad habits, our own misunderstandings, and our own misjudgments, and our own concessions to time, which will make it into the work that you see on the page. So please don't think of everything that I say or that anyone else says as gospel, despite my earlier comparing myself to the Son of God. You know, always look to your classical sort of texts on drawing and painting. You know, listen to the people who you believe do it best, whose work you think looks the most kind of on point and accurate. But even then, try and be scrupulous with your judgment and don't assume. Like if you hear a piece of advice from them that you think maybe isn't quite right, you know, it can be healthy to defer to their judgment and assume that they know more about it than you, because in 99% of cases they probably will. But don't completely ignore that part of your brain that says, I'm not 100% sure about that. You know, that doesn't seem to bear up to scrutiny. I mean, I certainly have those faults in my drawing and painting myself, which I only ever really realise are there sometime after the fact when I look back at my older work, and it looks incredibly amateurish by comparison to what I may be currently doing. And of course, this work I'm doing now may look very amateurish to me in a year or 2 years' time. What I'm doing with the antenna here was kind of an aborted attempt to suggest a greater sense of force by having the antenna bend, but ultimately, in order to do that effectively, I really would have had to have more than just the very top of it bend, because in a way, the very top of it is the part that's going to be least affected by the force of the cape. It's going to be the part that goes from the cape where the sort of tension is coming from down to the rooftop or whatever where the antenna is anchored, and everything else is just going to be sort of tangential from that. So I ended up just keeping it a bit rigid in order to save myself the time of completely redoing the antenna, not least because that prop of the antenna wasn't particularly malleable, and bending stuff and warping stuff in Photoshop isn't often particularly convincing way of doing it. So I just decided to keep the antenna very, very rigid, as if it's made of very high tensile steel. I don't know if I'm using the word tensile correctly there. Again, you can correct me by following me on Twitter and hitting me up with the correct information. Apologies, my nose is running again. I'm just going to have to quickly deal with that. We are at least at the 45-minute mark or so of this commentary now, so there shouldn't be too many more instances of that uh, that kind of physical exorcism left to go. Here, just adding some basic background colours. I mean, you know, blue for the sky, yellow because it stands out from blue, green because it's neither blue or yellow, or and it's not red either. Yeah, it's not a particularly sophisticated set of logical deductions involved in my colour choices here. But sometimes the simplest, most self-evident truths in art or illustration are the ones which prove the most useful, and to which you return again and again. Now, being at the 45-minute mark or so, and having a lot of the subsequent work here be fairly kind of obvious with these sort of cut-out stencil colours and everything, it might be a good time for me to turn to Facebook and Twitter, where I always, when I'm doing a ImagineFX tutorial, I always put out the word to my crew of fans and well-wishers to find out if they've got any questions about the subject at hand. In this case, capes. And we'll see what just some of those people have to say. Just bear with me a second while I find that particular subject. Here we are, capes. Now, Cameron Foster asks, why do you think capes have become so intrinsic to the public perception of superheroes, despite them being largely absent from Marvel and Golden Age DC? Well, I mean, I would dispute that claim that they're largely absent from Marvel and Golden Age DC. Golden Age Green Lantern had a cape. Golden Age Batman and Superman had capes. A lot of the major figures in Golden Age DC had capes. Marvel maybe less so, but then Golden Age Marvel is not really the resonant era of Marvel. It tends to be Silver Age, which has survived so well. Although admittedly there aren't a huge amount of capes in the kind of mainstay heroes in the Marvel universe that have survived from that time period. Thor obviously has one. And I can't think of too many other real examples off the top of my head. So he does have a point, that only a select few of the real iconic superheroes have capes. So why are they so associated, and why have they become a kind of synecdoche for superheroes in general? Well, I suppose the answer to that would be that to sort of answer that, you have to kind of look to the purpose of the cape. Why do superheroes wear capes in the first place? And generally it's to create a sort of air of drama and theatricality. Zorro had a cape. Dracula had a cape. These very theatrical, sort of not necessarily superhuman figures in the case of Zorro, but kind of hyper-powered individuals had capes. Certainly in the 30s. So I don't know if Dracula in the original text had a cape. I'm disgustingly illiterate, or not illiterate. That would suggest that I can't read, but you know what I mean. So I suppose the answer is that the cape, the function that the cape serves is to imbue drama and dynamism to the image of a character. And very few characters of fiction who bear capes have survived in the popular lexicon. There is still Dracula to some extent, although in various adaptations he doesn't always wear a cape. Zorro has kind of lost a lot of his currency. So they are kind of the last kind of remaining icons who wear that theatrical garment. And capes are associated with, drama and excitement from a particular era and action. And so they are kind of inherently or inextricably entwined with the iconography of superheroes who draw most of their most iconic kind of looks from that time period. I've just realised I haven't looked at I've been looking at Facebook. I haven't looked at the video of this drawing for a while, so I should probably get back to that briefly. I've added some highlights, as you can see, just in a sort of yellowy orange colour, because I wanted to give that kind of warm light. And I'm currently in the process of adding a sort of halftone filter to it, just to kind of smooth out those slightly more rudimentary the slightly more rudimentary colouring, the rendering of the colour, to make it a little bit less obvious that I did it relatively quickly. Pay no attention to those Facebook alerts at the bottom of the screen. Yes, so let's see. I'll keep the video in my field of vision this time, so that I don't overlook anything too important while I look at another question. Let's see. Niall McGalloway asks, is it more difficult to portray the climate in the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn? I would say perhaps Cape Horn. I don't know that much about Cape Horn, but the Cape of Good Hope certainly. The key to depicting the atmospheric conditions in the Cape of Good Hope would not necessarily be a matter of trying to get across, literally communicate the sort of type of kind of air current and climatic condition, not climactic, sorry, climatic, I don't know, conditions there, but you would use the surrounding fauna and flora in order to try and suggest those things. There's a lot of horticulture in the world, in the Cape of Good Hope, that is endemic, that only grows there. So I would say that's probably the best way to suggest it. Cape Horn, I would imagine the principles would be the same. Cameron Foster asks, will ape or sea ape ever take off as another name for chimpanzee? Well, this is typical of my brother. Cameron Foster is my brother. He's been, he's always going on about this, trying to popularise his nicknames for animals, and I keep telling him it's not going to happen, and it'll never catch on. But God bless him if he doesn't keep trying. No, Cameron, I think it's unlikely that sea ape will ever take off as another name for a chimpanzee. But keep chasing that dream, and one day, you never know. The lexicographers who compile the Oxford English Dictionary might just throw you a bone one day. We are approaching the end now. I mean, we still have 10 minutes left, so I don't know why I'm putting up that kind of disclaimer. But we are approaching the denouement in this rollicking adventure of Cape dynamics. And as you can see, I'm trying to add a little bit more depth to the background, but I end up abandoning that completely, as I felt like it was more. I mean, the whole purpose of having everything else be in silhouette and the cape be the only thing that was sort of properly rendered was to emphasise the cape, and I thought that it would be visually confusing to have the background sort of a bit more rendered as well, and then have these blocky silhouette forms in the foreground as well. I felt it led to a less kind of visually clear and coherent image. So rather than rendering the background, I chose to add the arrows which would tie in with the text of the article. I hope that these ruminations on how to draw capes and cloth and just the broader world of drawing comics for a living have been of some use to you. I don't know why they would be beyond the very basic information that I've provided in the article. I have a tendency to become quite self-indulgent on these commentaries. So apologies for that. But if you have any thoughts or questions about the process or how I could improve these tutorials, then please do get in touch. I'll give the details again at the end of this tutorial for eager young beavers to contact me and communicate your feelings about all this. Now, just a little bit of last minute tightening things up and rendering here. There's not a great deal I can add verbally. I suppose one thing to remember is that there are three major forces at work in the shape of this cape. There are also kind of three main anchor points which sit, if we were to see this in plan view or overhead view, we would see them as a triangle. We have the point at which the cape is snagged on the antenna, and we have the two anchor points on the shoulders of the hero in question, which means that while our cape is sort of slightly triangular in the other direction, i.e. wider at the bottom than at the shoulders, the tension that's applied to it and the shapes that are influencing it are kind of the inverse of that. That's why we get that big sag in the middle, because that is the furthest point from the three anchor points. It may not look like it's the furthest point. You would maybe think it would be more central in the image rather than so close to the hero. But of course, having two anchor points on the one end do influence the position of that sag. If the cape were only attached to the sort of the kind of center of the superhero's collar, where on a coat you might normally have that little loop of material where you can hang it up, then the sag in the cape would be more kind of central in the image, but as it is, it's not. And if you're ever in any doubt about these kind of things, that's what your photo reference is for. Almost all the information in terms of the sort of the dynamics of this cloth in the image come from that photo that I've taken, and only the sort of the merest of additional input and sort of artistic kind of know-how has been implemented by me, but it can make all the difference. It is very possible, no matter how good your reference material, to create quite a poor piece of artwork, purely because your understanding of form isn't particularly adept. You can't have to constantly keep studying things and remembering visual information. It's not just a case of using a photo and then completely forgetting it. Try and remember the principles that it has, that you've incorporated from it into the drawing. How does cloth bend under certain circumstances? How does it react to forms and forces surrounding it? Anyway, okay, I've still got another 5 minutes, or 4.5. Okay, well, have we got any more questions from Facebook or Twitter? Cameron Foster has attempted to create a kind of humorous question by obliquely referencing Jeff Capes, the popular British strongman from the 1970s or 80s. I can't remember. But that would have been a very difficult joke to communicate verbally without kind of giving the game away. That's mostly it, really. I'm yet to arrive at the conclusion that the background is better as a single sheet of colour. But this halftone pattern I've used on the cape seems to be working okay. And I do resolve to use it on the skin and hair of our protagonist here as well, because everything else, I've been quite scrupulous about the colour values I've used in the rest of the image. They're all colour values that, if they were printed back in the day when halftones were sort of standard in the printing process, they would be solid blocks of colour rather than sort of stippled by halftone. Whereas the shading on the cape and the skin colour and hair colour would all be represented as a series of dots of one colour over another. So hopefully that will make the image more visually pleasing to you, but it's just an aesthetic choice. It has very little to do with drawing ability or any kind of real useful transferable skills. We are now approaching the very end. Tremendous relief, I imagine, to many of you. And so final words, keep drawing, keep yourself healthy in order to avoid my plight. Keep yourself as educated and informed, which I suppose means the same thing, as possible. And don't take anybody's word as complete gospel, but do listen to the advice of other professionals. Just be, circumspect and try to cultivate your own good judgment. Because ultimately it will be that defines the shape of your career. You can be the best draftsman in the world, but if you make poor career choices, then your work is going to suffer. So that's it, really. Have fun. I'm sure you'll all be gathering around the fire together to draw capes with each other. And if you need to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at JumbleCashback, JumbleCashback. My Instagram address is in the magazine. I am on DeviantArt as well if you search for Tom R. Foster. And that's about it. Have a great time. Have a really good day. Try not to talk to people who look dangerous. But don't make too many judgments either. Remember, we're all human and have our own frailties. Try and avoid marauders. So that's it. Oh, here I'm trying to experiment a little with the background stuff, trying to create a little style element to compensate for the lack of detail in the background. In the end, it turns out to be a fool's errand, and I just end up settling on what I've had for the last 10 minutes or so. But that's often the case, and that's the advantage of using computers, is that you can default to an earlier version without corrupting your original material. Right, well, goodbye, good luck, be well, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much.